And good afternoon, South Central. It is afternoon unless you happen to be in El Paso, which I guess then it's not quite noon yet. But wanted to cover today some of the new features that are in FireWare 11.10. This is just come out and given us the ability to do a couple of really cool new things. So wanted to start out with where there'll be just a couple of slides here at the beginning. I promise no death by PowerPoint. And in fact, while I'm thinking of it, I'm going to jump out of the presentation. I did want to show you guys, anytime a new version of our software comes out, if you go out to the WatchGuard support page, from support, there will be a technical documentation link, which is the page I'm on right now. From the technical documentation page, if you hit product documentation, you can get other things, hardware guides, quick start guides, configuration examples, video tutorials. But for the purposes of what I wanted to show you, I'm going to jump into product doc. And once we get into the documentation for those, anytime WatchGuard releases a new version of the software, you will see out here this PowerPoint that's available for download. So if you want to get a jump on what's out here, or take a quick review of what we go over today, or you're just looking to see, you know, get a reminder of what this are. They often have configuration examples inside of these, so you can see how to turn the features on and what to do with them. So those are out there and available. Now, in the meantime, since we announced the last webinar, we have 11.10 that's out. There is an 11.10.1 with some minor changes in that. I'm going to focus on 11.10 because that's the big features that I want to talk about. And really, the biggest new features for this is domain names and these. And as we go through, I'm going to refer to the PowerPoint slides for a bit and then jump over into the configuration of the firewall itself. So this is probably one of the biggest new features that we've been asking for years, and engineering's finally been able to deliver this to us, is the ability to create a policy based on a fully qualified domain name. Now, prior to version 11.10, I'm just going to open up and create a packet filter for HTTP traffic. Prior to version 11.10, if we wanted to say from anybody on our internal network going to a specific domain name, we had to add that in as a host name or DNS lookup. And what would happen when we did this, for example, I love using google.com because it really illustrates my point here. I put in google.com. When I do this, DNS, what it does is it resolves all of the addresses that are related to google.com right now. The problem with this is next week Google will add or remove an address, or if you're using some other page that's not Google, say you're dealing with a content delivery network for software updates or video streaming, any one of those, any of the big guys out there, Akamai, all of these are all going to have multiple IP addresses depending on where you're at in the country and what time of day sometimes it can even be. So you build this rule now, it'll work as is because it's looked up all of the addresses, but next week when those addresses change, your rule can be broken and we're not able to get access to that. So what we can do now, when we add in a fully qualified domain name, we can now put in google.com. It's going to be able to do a DNS lookup for us. Now, one of the things the nice things that we can do with this is when we add this, we can use a wildcard character. So if I want to say anything at google.com, any subdomains, anything like that, I can allow that to go through this way using the wildcard character. So now what I've done is I've created a rule that says from any trusted on my network, this one is going to match google.com, any subdomain at that. And let me just give this a good name in here. So we'll call this Tips and Tricks Demo. just so I can find it in my rule set easily. And so now when I look here, as this comes along, this rule is more specific than feed off of my Active Directory. But now I can say, as I'm going down this list, the first rule that matches, going out to the web, anything that's going to google.com is going to be allowed. And then we have other rules take precedence farther down if it doesn't match that. So if you're going to gmail.com, it's going to not match this particular rule. Now, where we recommend using this is where you want to set up access to specific domains by name, rather than having to look up and keep up to date with their IP addresses. You can do this, select those names, select those domain names, and then block all other traffic. So if you have a list of these are the websites that our users are allowed to get to, we can build a rule. We can do multiple domains in here, so if we want to also add in, for example, all of the web pages that my users are allowed to get to, either without authentication in this case, or if I had a rule farther down in the list that was blocking all of the traffic. So we've been asking for this feature for a long time. It's finally implemented. Now I do want to cover, there are a couple of gotchas along the way with this. And so I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint slides for just a second. One of the gotchas is you cannot use multiple wildcards. So you can't do example star.com or putting multiple layers of the of nested wildcards in here. So star.star.example.com. These are not going to be supported. Got to be just star and a.b.example. So if you've got multiple child domains on that star.example.com will cover you for those. So the way this is actually working is you think back and remember how your client does a DNS lookup getting out to the web. So let me make that just a little bit bigger for those of you that are viewing this on small screens. The way this works is your client sends a request. Your client has a DNS server set through its IP config, and the first thing it does when you want to go to Microsoft.com, it sends a request to the local DNS server. In many cases, that's your domain controller in a Windows domain. But then one request out on port 53 to whatever it has configured as forwarders that you've configured, wherever it goes to get its name resolution done, that domain controller sends those out on port 53. So what we've done is we've actually given the firewall the ability to sniff that port 53 traffic. So rather than having to do a DNS lookup every time somebody requests anything on the internet, which could add a lot of latency, we pay attention and we listen to what your domain controller or your DNS server is doing. And as those port 53 DNS traffic comes through, anytime we see an A record, we are going to, anytime we see a DNS reply coming back, we look for A records that are set up in your rules. The firewall basically builds a table, and so when DNS passes through the firebox, it stores the DNS lookups. Seeing A records, because that's what we're doing when we're surfing the web. It's not going to do MX records, any of those. It'll ignore all of that. But basically in the background, the firewall is building a DNS table so that you no longer have to do a lookup every time. So it makes the firewall a little bit smarter in the way it's doing it, so we're not introducing a lot of latency. So there are a couple of qualifications here that I want to point out as well. If you want to do fully qualified domain names, you've got to have a DNS server set up on your firewall. It's as simple as coming into your network configuration, going to your WINS DNS tab. you do have to have a domain controller or a DNS server on your firewall so that it knows how to do DNS resolution. Server, preferably an internal DNS server. Depending on where you're going in the world, if you have your clients pointing to an internal DNS server and your firewall pointing to 8.8.8.8 for Google or one of the other big ones out there, there's a chance based on where you are in the world and time zones and time to live and all of those different characteristics and factors of DNS that you could have different results returned if they're not pointing to the same area. Now, the one last consideration that you might run into is this is somewhat limited, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but I've seen it in the past if you've got especially a small business server that has, when your clients go to look up abc.com, they want the public web page which is hosted externally. So you've got to create a DNS zone on your internal DNS server to resolve that public address, because otherwise DNS just gets confused because it thinks it's a local address. It can't find the www address. It never gets there. So when that happens, if you have an internal DNS server that has public IP addresses loaded on it, unless that traffic traverses the firewall, normally your client is just going to go to that server. It's going to get the response to its A record lookup and say, oh, here's my public IP, and it'll send the request out for that public IP. Because that request never traversed the firewall wasn't able to sniff it. The way you get around that is they made the recommendation in here, if you have an internal DNS server, put it on a different that DNS request still traverses the firewall. We're able to sniff it and get that information. Again, like I said, it's a fairly limited scenario, but it is a possibility for those out there. Other things to remember when you're doing fully qualified domain names, remember that an FQDN can correspond to multiple IP addresses. So depending on geographic location, what people have set up for DNS, even DNS round robin, DNS servers can return different IP addresses based on time zone, load balancing, all of these other factors. And then the other side of this is a specific IP might map to several different fully qualified domain names. If you've got multiple websites hosted on a single server, or you can have the opposite of that, multiple FQDNs for the same site. So abc.com is allowed, and abc.com and xyz.com are both hosted on the same web server at the same address. When you allow abc.com, that also implies that xyz.com is allowed because it's sharing an IP address out there. Just, you know, these are some basics for DNS, just things to keep in mind when you're creating your rules. If you just know those things that they can happen in the background, you won't be surprised when a situation like that pops up. Now, if you are using fully qualified domain names in your logging, it will show up, and you'll even see it in your dimension server that it has resolved these things as a fully qualified domain name. Even if you a blocked rule, which is something cool you can do now, if you want to just add your blocks and add a DNS fully qualified domain name in there and block it that way. That will show in your Firebox System Manager. So again, fully qualified domain names, being able to give that names, not numbers, is something we've been waiting for a long time, and we're glad it's finally here. So the next big new feature, and as I blaze on through here, is the ability to give users quotas. What this is basically doing is saying you can set a certain amount of bandwidth or a certain amount of time that your individual users on your network can have access to the internet for. Gives them a daily limit. You know, if you have a rule that you're allowed to surf the internet for an hour a day, or 100 megabytes a day, whichever comes first. Anytime a user exceeds that limit, they are now going to receive to say you have a 1,000 meg a day or 100 minutes a day, however you set that up. So when we set these up, this is actually pretty simple to do. We cut them up here under our set menu. Under our actions, we now have a quota. And first thing to do, of course, is enable the feature. And it'll give you a note, this is 1110 or higher. So it gives you a pretty simple wizard to run through. So I'm going to say I've got a quota here. We'll call it demo. This is enabled. Now, the big thing that is required with this, in order to do quotas, you must do some type of authentication. This is going to work off of the Firebox users and groups, whether you're on the internal database on your firewall or Radius server or Active Directory. Either way, you've just got to define some way of looking at the groups. So I have an example, my marketing group. We'll select them. This quota rule will apply to anybody that's in the marketing group. And then we tie an action to them. So again, name of demo. And we can say these users are limited to a 9,999 megabytes a day or 120 minutes a day. Either way, either or, whichever one is reached first, it will block based on the first one reached. You don't have to satisfy both requirements to get somebody blocked. So I've created the quota action. I'll say, okay, it's there and in place. So let's look at this a little bit here. The quota action that I just built, that just basically fills in these first two tabs for you. From here, I can go into my HTTPS, my HTTP, and my TCP UDP proxies. I want to enable quotas on each one of these, and I'm actually, let me take, I'll do it just on the HTTP from here. And then the last tab that we've got is our quota exceptions. So this is the scenario, say your client computers run their own Windows updates, they're not pulling from a local update server, or they're doing antivirus updates, whatever the case may be. So I can put in star.microsoft.com, and I can put a few others in here. We'll say star.windowsupdate.com. Basically what the exceptions is going to say is if they visit these websites and pull data or spend time on these websites, these are not going to count against the individual user's quota. You can import this as a CSV file to bring those in. So I've gone through, I've set up a quota rule. It's for my marketing group. I've created a quota action. I chose one of my policies to apply that to my HTTP proxy. Now it does do a combined total. So if you do HTTP and HTTPS, if you enable it on both of those, it will do the combined between the two. Whenever they reach their 120 minutes, it will kick them off the internet. So the last piece I wanted to show you, I did have a third place there where I could apply that to, my TCP UDP proxy. If I don't do it through the rule, I can come into the proxy policy, and I guess TCP UDP is the bad one to look at because it has the different quotas there. But you can do this. There's a checkbox right here that just says enable bandwidth and time quotas. It's as easy as that. So if you've built it and you find you've missed a rule, you can go back through your rules, turn on your quotas just with a checkbox right there in the rules. So let's just jump back to the PowerPoint. I showed you how to get these set up and what to do with them, so I'll skip a few slides here. And just the things to remember at the end. Quota limits are reset automatically every day starting at midnight. If you change the configuration for the particular rules that quotas are applied to, that will reset the quota, and they'll get another hour or whatever you've allowed. If you reboot the firewall, it will reset their quota. Now you do have, if you find somebody that's been working away. They're working on a special project. They got bit by the quota. I don't have anything turned on and saved here yet, but if I had this in here, an individual user, I would be able to highlight that user, and then corner there is a way to reset their quota. This will start them over. They will get another hour on their quota, and this is through the Firebox System Manager, where you see your traffic monitor. There's a new tab in here for user quotas. So that gives us the two big new features on the 1110. There's some other stuff in here that's some minor updates, and so I'll continue to run through some of the slides and just point out the highlight here. When you are looking, they gave us a whole new section called monitoring enhancements, but you can see on that quota tab, you will see the user, their quota action, how much they've actually used. You'll be able to see that through there. And this actually shows you, again, what we just looked at, being able to set the quota. I'm going to come back to the Gateway Wireless Controller, the rogue access points, because we'll talk about that in another. Some other, when we're looking at our Firebox System Manager, we look at the Gateway Wireless Controller, and I look at my wireless clients. I can actually now see signal strength from that individual client here. There's a column for the signal strength. Most everything in my house is fairly close together, so everybody's got either 4 or 5 bars. But if you see somebody that's having some problems connecting, you might be able to look here and see, hey, they've got a really weak signal. We might want to consider an extra access point out in that area where that person's hanging out. I'm going to come back to the enhanced VPN diagnostics tools because there's a whole section on those as well. But this is the really cool thing that is really helpful for a lot of users. When we do branch office VPNs, a lot of times we're dealing with third-party firewalls or somebody else's systems where we might not see exactly what's going on. And normal procedure when you're having a problem with a VPN was you come into your setup and you would go to logging and you would look at diagnostic log levels and VPN and IKE, and we'd crank that all the way up to debug. And then we'd get 1,000 lines of logs for every VPN tunnel that tried to come up, and then you had to try and pick through and find what was going on. Well, we've made an enhancement now. Rather than having to turn the debugging up there, when we come into here and our front panel, when we have branch office VPN tunnels created, and this tunnel is actually inactive right now because the other side of it is turned off right now and disconnected. Had to do some updates to my lab for a demo I've got coming up. But when we have a tunnel down and not actually working on our network, what we're going to actually see is we'll see error messages in here, and the PowerPoint has a few examples of that. So you'll see error messages, you'll see warning statuses. There's some examples in here somewhere. There we go. So received, you'll get an error message in here, received ESP encryption, triple DES. I was expecting AES. So you now know where the mismatch on that configuration is and what kind of thing you'll need to go and look for. No proposal chosen. Check the VPN IKE diagnostic messages on the remote gateway endpoint for more info. So you'll get these kind of information from this same interface here. The other tool that we've greatly improved, as I back up a couple of slides here, is the VPN diagnostic report. And this was a hidden tool that was in the Firebox System Manager. We go to tools, we go to diagnostic tasks, we had a VPN in here. And in the past, this tool was here, but it basically just ran a report and said, hey, nothing was, it gave you all of your settings. It didn't actually give you information other than this is what your settings are. So now when we do this, if we run this report, and this is actually going to take a little while, so I probably won't wait for it on the webinar here. But when you run this report, you're going to get a lot more information. It's going to give you a conclusion. It's going to summarize what was observed, list any detected errors, and include suggestions on next steps. It'll also show address pairs and how traffic is allowed to go through, whether it's one directional or bidirectional traffic, and also will show you what policies are available for to control that traffic on that VPN tunnel. So here we go. I took a little bit of time there, but it says unable to negotiate the branch office VPN tunnel because the interface link status is down. Hey, that's a good error message to have. And here, after we've run that report, we're also seeing it now in our Firebox system manager as well, so that you actually have some feedback on why your tunnels are not coming up without cranking up the logs and trying to see what's in there, needle in a haystack type thing. And as I make this a little bit bigger, you know, so some of you will think this is really cool, other people might not use it. But it gives us all of our status, gateway lists each of our endpoints, where they're going through, what's going on. So a lot more information, and even at the end, list your related logs to that. So the tool is much more useful than it ever has been in the past. Now at this point we are pushing 12:30. I know the webinar is only scheduled to run for 30 minutes, so for those of you that do need to bail out, I just want to pause here real quick and point out I do record all of these webinars. If you go out to YouTube and you can either search for DGeisler, WGSE, that'll give you the individual videos, or you can also search for WG South Central Tips and Tricks. And that's the YouTube channel where I'm posting all of these videos, and we'll review that again at the end. But for anybody that needs to bail at the half-an-hour mark here, I just wanted to make sure you saw that. So let's move on through the other enhancements here. All of these things, it's available in both the Web UI and the Firebox System Manager. A couple of other things, you can now see some information on our routing table. Some of these are minor things, so I'm going to skip through and not spend a whole lot of time on routing tables. Firewatch enhancements and dimension, and on the Web UI, it can now go full screen. There's an example of what it looks like, right? Cool little enhancement, not much to it though. You can also select which information appears and customize that a little bit. As far as the subscription services go, in our Firebox Policy Manager under Subscription Services, we've always had the ability to run through a wizard to get these set up and running. The improvement in the 11.10 is they have now added the, and I'm just going to cancel that, in the Web UI, they now have the same wizards available for those of you that like your wizards. The cool little feature as far as I'm concerned here is by default, if you remember several webinars ago, my first 5 settings that every firewall should have, I reminded you that your update services are not turned on automatically. So we had to go into subscription services. I always pick intrusion prevention because it's the easiest one to get there. If you'll notice, I've got my updates, automatic updates turned on. If I turn that off, I now get a warning message on this screen, and you will see this anywhere you have this update server button. So under intrusion prevention, under app control, under gateway antivirus, you'll get a warning that your automatic updates are disabled, just to help you remember to go in and check that box so that we get updates for all of our subscription services in there. VPN enhancements, not a lot here other than in 11.10 there is an updated SSL VPN client. Biggest thing there is it will now support the Windows TAP driver that's in Windows 8.1 natively. Certificate management enhancements, you can manage certificates from the Web UI in addition to the traditional Firebox System Manager view certificates. I know if everybody loves the Web UI as much as I do, we'll spend about that much time on it. Another thing, there is now a checkbox available to have it automatically update trusted root certificates. It's just a quick checkbox to turn on. You typically don't run into this because we hope you're upgrading and keeping your firewalls up to date every few years. If a box has been running for 4 or 5 years, some of those root certificates might expire, and you in theory could have some problems with certificates because of that. This checkbox just lets the box go out and look on its own for updated root certificates. So for our wireless access points, there's been a few enhancements here, and we'll go in through these and kind of cover a few of them here. But basically, we now have the ability to do rate shaping per SSID. This is basically saying if we've got multiple SSIDs broadcasting on a single radio, a single SSID cannot overwhelm and take all of the bandwidth available and rob the other SSIDs. So if we come back into our setup here, network, gateway wireless controller, we'll look at the different settings here. So if I want my guest network, I can do some rate shaping and say they are at a base rate, a ceiling rate, and a burst. What those are, the base rate is the base throughput allowed. You're not allowed to exceed that base rate except for your burst. The burst is how much you can go beyond that, and then the ceiling rate gives you the hard limit. Include base plus burst gives you your ceiling. And I don't know why in the UI, they should have done a different order on those. It should be base, burst, and then ceiling. Defaults have the base and the ceiling set the same. If you wanted to add an extra 200K to a burst, you would want to crank this up by the corresponding 200K as well, and that gives you your total that this particular SSID can, the bandwidth that it can use. The next feature here is you can now turn off SSIDs based on a time period. So if I want my guest network to start working at 7 a.m. in the morning and at 5 p.m., or we'll be a little generous and we'll say as of 7 p.m., so this SSID is basically on for 12 hours a day. Outside of those hours, the SSID just goes away, it shuts down, it's not available. Even if somebody has it remembered in their system, they're not going to be able to get on your guest wireless during the times that your business is dark and nobody should be in there using your Wi-Fi anyway. You can now do a scheduled restart of the access points. This gets into the access point configuration as opposed to the SSID configuration. Gives you the ability to just set a manual update if you want these things to reboot once a day, once a week. If you set them up to reboot daily, weekly, if you have multiple access points, they are going to space themselves by 90 seconds, so the whole wireless system doesn't all go down at once. Small change to the Firebox System Manager. You can now select multiple APs and tell them to individually upgrade. Then the last piece, this is for you guys out there that have PCI compliance issues. We can now also turn on rogue access point detection so that if we have a list of known access points, if we see something else, we're going to be able to pick that up and let you know that, hey, there are new access points being detected out there on our network. Some of the other smaller features as we go on, single sign-on enhancements. We now support Exchange 2013 for the Exchange monitor. For RDP logins, the clientless single sign-on that I use to tie to my Active Directory and authenticate everybody in the background without forcing them to a page. It will now recognize RDP logins. We've always had a terminal server agent that you would load on your terminal server farms that gives you the ability to access that. But if you have multiple people, say, logging into a Windows 7 workstation for some reason on your network, our single sign-on agent is now going to recognize that. We also now recognize fast user switching. So if you do fast user switching on a shared computer, as of Windows Vista and higher, we will recognize fast user switching for our single sign-on. You can also now send single sign-on requests through a branch office VPN tunnel. It's a checkbox that you would allow that to go through. However, we do recommend if you are trying to do single sign-on user authentication, say in a remote branch office that's not big enough to have its own domain controller, we still do recommend loading the single sign-on client on each of the machines on the other end, so you aren't dealing with the issues of latency across a VPN tunnel if you have a less than reliable network or a slower network connection out there. Minor change to rapid deploy enhancements. You can now change your external interface number in a CSV file. For those of you that are doing rapid deploy, that's cool. For everybody else, you know, not a big deal. Another small enhancement, but something cool, especially if you're out in a branch office somewhere, is, let me cancel out of the wireless setup. Under setup on our NTP, this is another one of those settings that I included in my first 5. Every firewall should have this. Turn on NTP to synchronize the system time. That way you're getting accurate logs. You're not having other issues. But now you can check a box that allows the firewall to act as an NTP server on your local network. If you don't have a local domain controller that's going to control your Windows system time, you can add a DHCP option for NTP and tell it to point to the firewall. The firewall will now act as your NTP server. Moving right along through a couple of these other changes. Multiple servers for DHCP relay. The limit used to be just a single DHCP relay. You can now put multiples in there. DHCP v6 prefix delegation. If you can subnet DHCP v6 already, let me know. You can train me how to do it. But there's a few changes in there. Improvements to the command line interface to show the routing table. Nobody ever uses that. The XTM configuration report, and this is another little hidden gem, and I have to actually log into the web UI to bring this guy up. And I should have preloaded this, but I forgot. So we'll get the admin console up here on my local firewall. See if it wants to log in. This is another little hidden gem that's in the web UI only. If you come over here to System and your configuration file, from the web UI you've had the ability to download the configuration file, that's that XML, but you can also run this XTM configuration report that gives you the ability to see all of your firewall settings in one spot. So as I run this, it's going to pop this up, and it's going to give me this XTM configuration report that I can then hit the print button over here, print it to PDF, print it out. This contains every setting everywhere in my firewall, starting with the basics, network configuration. There's my public, all of my interfaces, my public IP, my internal IP, and then it goes through and gives you the details of each of those interfaces. It will show you your VLAN settings. As we go through it, show you your aliases. If we jump down to the firewall policy setting, there is every firewall policy I've got on my network, and then the detailed settings for each one of those firewall policies. You can see I've turned on log messaging for every policy so I get the most out of my dimension server. So whether you're using this for documentation purposes, to put in a customer's binder, or to have a hard copy, or if somebody, in many cases we hear auditors want this type of information, you'll jump in and be able to print this out and hand it off to the auditors and give them that. I think when it actually generates the PDF file, it's probably close to, if I can find my PDF writer here, I think it's about 40 pages long, give or take. So there's a lot of information in here, but it'll give you great documentation. You know, you really could rebuild the firewall directly from this. So we won't wait for that to generate. Logging and reporting enhancements. As of 11/10, and this will be something to remember for those of you that are partners and are taking the Fireware Essentials Certification exam. Prior to 11.10, you could only send log messages to a single log server. as of 11.10, you now can send two different log servers, so 2 sets of dimension, 2 log servers, or primary and backup, however you want to do that. But you can broadcast log messages now to 2 locations. And this just some quick example, screenshot of where you would do that, log server 1, log server 2. You've got all that information. Anything else new? The help system, if you go out from any of our screens here, if we hit help, it'll take you out to the web. They have updated and refreshed this, a little bit better navigation, better search capabilities, and a fancy new logo for the FireWare help. But this is great. It'll give you, we clicked on the NTP setting, so it's actually got configurations for both the policy manager and the web UI. We'll give you examples and all of the information. It is context-sensitive help for these things. Other features in here, you can go out, yeah, here's what's new presentation, that information. So with that, that'll wrap it up. Those are the new features in 11.10. Just as a reminder for anybody that turns off now, we have the YouTube page available where we are recording all of these. These typically get posted within a day or two. If you look for WatchGuard, WG South Central Tips and Tricks, or search for DGeisler WGSE, I'll have that on the name of it, the year, the month, and then the name of the recording that we did. So thank you guys very much for your time, and I will turn it back over to Elaine for anything else. Again, remember the questions. Please fill out your questions. We will respond to email for those. We won't take time to ask them live now. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Elaine.
Thanks very much, Dan. Great webinar, and thank you for those of you that hung on to the end here. I will go ahead and leave the webinar up for just another minute in case any of you have any additional questions that you would like to get typed into the question and answer pane. So feel free to drop off the line or add in your questions real quick, and I'll keep that line open for just another minute or two. Thanks again for joining, and have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks, Dan.